We are back with part 3 of our Parade's End run-through. And in this episode, we're going to look at what's left after Ruin. The events of episode 3 largely take place in 1916, largely line up with book 1, Some Do Not, part 2, but without the reflections. So, as we said in episode 2 prior, Stoppard had gone back to the reflections that occur in part 2 of Some Do Not and turned them into their whole episode in and of themselves, and now he's actually going to detail the events that occur as the characters are going about in real time in part 2. And of course that opens with Tietjens' return from war with a certain element of shell shock, and he doesn't quite know who he is. And as he's beginning to re-emerge and understand exactly who he is and where he is in the world, and recall that was a world where he had believed it was the end of England and was a reactionary, looking back wistfully at the 18th century, not admiring the 19th, not admiring the industrial age, not admiring the Tory party subservient to Mammon. And so he's going to have to relearn that in the midst of realising that he's undergoing his own ruin financially, which was set up in the previous episode, mainly through the banker Brownlie, who's annoyed that Sylvia is still remaining chaste against him. And so, what does ruin mean to a man who is a reactionary, really? Of course, he still has hope. He has hope in the ability that he had to stir himself in 1914. He had hope with Valentine one-up. Not much hope, but her existence and their parley in the field in 1911. Intellectual back and forth, their quiet admiration for one another, meant that though he felt he would never leave Sylvia, that he could see that there was a future. Valentine could encompass some sort of future. This sort of hope is immediately going to go from him in this episode, and he has to reach rock bottom. He has to do certain things that show that he is beyond faith in the future. And when he loses his faith, one of the first things he's going to do is to let his son be brought up Roman Catholic in the manner that Sylvia Tietjens would like.
If I must to the Greenwood girl.
Do you mean it? I may bring up Michael as a Catholic.
A Roman Catholic. You're teaching pleased to use that term. But I'm obviously not the man to have charge of the future master of Groby. I'm not a whole man anymore.
When did you...
When my checks were dishonoured.
But it was only that squid.
But I let it happen, and my father believed the squids too, but I let that happen. A man who can't do any better than that had better let the mother bring up the child.
I loved the little beggar with all my soul from the first moment I saw him. Perhaps that's the secret.
Well, thank God. He has softened your heart.
You're to have, Father.
I recall that one of his important pieces to Tietjens when he accepted Sylvia back was to annoy her that their son Michael would be brought up in the Protestant manner. Of course, that's the Tietjens manner. Yet we have here, on page 172, 173, Christopher, though heir to Groby, yields. I have no objection to papists, and no objection to white lies for papists. The heir to Groby should respect old women always, and old family servants in particular. It hasn't perhaps struck you that the boy is the heir to Groby, this being Michael. Sylvia said, if your second brother is killed... Remember, there are multiple more brothers in the book than in the series, where there's only Mark. But your eldest brother, he, Tietjens says, has got a French woman near Euston Station, that being Mark. He lived with her for over 15 years of afternoons when there was no race meetings. She'll never let him marry, and she's past the childbearing stage. So there's no one. Sylvia said, you mean that I may bring up the child as a Catholic? Tietjens says, a Roman Catholic. You'll teach him please to use that term before myself, if I ever see him again. And of course the reason is he believes not that it's Drake's child necessarily, but that he can't fend for the boy, that he can't stand to rear him if he is a man whose reputation is muddied. And so then we get into the broader circumspection of how did his reputation become muddied. There's a bit more to this in the book than we see in the series. It's not, yes, Brownlie wants to have him ruined, but he spreads it not just through the ability of bouncing back a check, but also through the societal clubs. And there's this whole scheme where Mark believes in the club has this book where they can put a black mark against your name. Mark's at the time friend, though mainly just a gossiper, Ruggles, who we were briefly introduced to in episode 2, is a key avenue of spreading rumour and gossip throughout these clubs. So it's more that his name gets stained in the club than just a brief deflection of the check. And of course, in the meantime, the man McMaster, who was going to take his duties when Tietjens went to war in 1914, he would do them better if he would do them more dishonestly, as Tietjens said, has been knighted, mainly for calculations and work whose main responsibility lies with Tietjens. So he's taken the credit for Tietjens' work, essentially. And he's also been married to Mrs. Duchemin some 9 months. That's established on page 188. Tietjens sort of finds out all of this in dribs and drabs as he comes back from the scenes of having been undergone shell shock. Here's the paragraph in particular in which Tietjens talks about himself being overdrawn. It's on page 191. I was overdrawn, Tietjens says, for £15 yesterday. I should say for 3 or 4 hours. Recall he also depleted his funds because of a particular loan that wasn't a loan to McMaster to help them establish themselves before the purse strings of old mad Mr. Duchemin became loose for Mrs. Duchemin, now Mrs. McMaster. I was overdrawn, Tietjens says, for £15 yesterday. I should say for 3 or 4 hours. The course of a post from my army agent to your head office. During these 2 or 3 hours, your bank selected 2 out of 6 of my cheques to dishonour, both being under £2. The other one was sent back to my mess at Ealing, who won't, of course, give it back to me. That also was marked account overdrawn in the same handwriting, that handwriting being that of Brownlie. The society thinks Tietjens is a man who bets and speculates. And of course, he's the entire opposite of that. The problem with Tietjens is when he says that he does not bet, does not speculate, and Sylvia actually backs him up in this. There's a character in the book, Port Scatho. He's not in the TV adaptation. He represents this banking class, higher up than Brownlie, but with the inability to suspect the institution itself. So here we have page 192. Tietjens is ruined. He's overdrawn. Oh, Sylvia said, you couldn't suspect Christopher and me of being in a plot to blackmail you. No, I couldn't suspect that, the banker said, but the other explanation is just as extraordinary. To suspect the bank. The bank! How do you account? He was addressing Tietjens. His round head seemed to become square below. Emotion worked on his jaws. I'll tell you simply this, Tietjens says. You can then repair the matter as you think fit. 10 days ago I got my marching orders. As soon as I had handed over the officer who relieved me, I drew the cheques for everything I owed. To my military tailor, to the mess, for £1 12 shillings. This idea that the institution itself is incorruptible. Of course, think back to the Carlisle position. There will always be men in the institutions. So Scatho is meant to be, he's not meant to be too malignant a character. Right? He's meant to be a respectable enough man. The problem is the generation below him is full of Brownlies. It's the Carlislean position that men have to fill these institutions. Brownlie is the degenerated form of Port Scatho, but Port Scatho refuses to see that. The institution itself has become incorruptible, despite the fact lesser men are now stocking it. Stoppard makes the transition of Brownlie trying to get with Sylvia straight to a scene with Christopher's father hunting, in which the older gentleman will gossip that there's word against his boy at the club. And this is our first mention of the club, and then in our next scene we see Mark Tietjens with Ruggles, the arch gossiper. And so between Ruggles and Brownlie we get the club ruination. So Stoppard links all of this through the family. In the book, this happens, again, slightly more in a disconnected fashion. You have the scene where Sylvia's distraught at Christopher having resigned from the club, and it's only some bits later where you hear of the events of the father. And of course, that's another enormous aspect of Christopher's ruin. In part 3 is, yes, he's de facto heir to Groby because Mark won't sire, but his father starts to believe in the rumours, starts to believe in the ruination that's sprung up by the men like Brownlie and Ruffles. I mean, there's an enormous amount of stories. Valentine's believed to have had a war baby by Tietjens. That Sylvia even sometimes believes, in the book at least, page 155, when she's talking to Tietjens having come back from war. The girl, Sylvia said, you were so potty about it that horrible afternoon McMaster gave. That being Valentine. Has she had a war baby by you? They all say she's your mistress. And Tietjens, of course, says no. Miss Wannop is not my mistress. And as we've been introduced to Mark and the Ruffles scene, we should see some good descriptions of the Mark introduction as done in the book. It all occurs around page 222, which is chapter 4. We open with Mark as the preeminent character inside whose head we are. Mark Tietjens, his umbrella swinging sheepishly, his bowler hat pushed firmly down onto his ears to give him a sense of stability, walked beside the weeping girl in the quadrangle. I say, he said, don't give to old Christopher too beastly hard about his militarist opinions. Remember, he's going out tomorrow, and he's one of the best. And of course, his reaching out to Christopher and Valentine in this relationship sort of thing, seeing Christopher doesn't go back into a militant position, gets him dealing after horses behind the good bit behind the front line. He gets to quote Ford's words, Mark felt a warm satisfaction at having achieved an intimacy with her, that being Valentine, and his brother. So this idea that Mark is detached and has difficulty feeling intimacy with people is part of Mark's ambiguous nature. He embellishes the tired heir to Groby, the tired landowner, tired civilizationally, just lacking the energy. It just seems to give up without much rhyme or reason to it. And even though we get decent passages inside his head in the book, that ambiguity remains. We never can quite pin down Mark. He seems a man who his whole life has passed by, and he didn't realise that he had greater responsibilities than to just enjoy himself in London, to do the beats in the club and become a popular man in and around Whitehall. Indispensable, of course, is a word that always goes around, that what he is at Whitehall, and Christopher can never get his head around that. He's quite ordinary in many aspects, Mark, yet he is indispensable around Whitehall. Is it because he's scared of Groby? There's always this element that Christopher admires Groby. To him it's a mystical place, the tree, the symbolic paganism, the ancientness of it. But to Mark, his whole life, it has been the weight of being the heir. Christopher didn't have to live this. And so there's a sense that through his exhaustion, Mark, the exhaustion of the prospect of Groby having to be his, he goes and tucks himself away in London and works diligently in Whitehall, but actually abandons his, despite never giving up on his Yorkshire inheritance, he his Yorkshire characteristics and his sense that he is a Northman, he abdicates, not in one event, but but gradually, act by act in his life. Mark abdicates his role. Chapter 2, also with Tietjens coming back, being slightly broken. I mean, if Tietjens finishes chapter 1 of part 2 with, this is a selection of some of his lines to show how broken he is. I'm not a whole man anymore. And the evil eye that is on the might transferred itself to him. He stopped and said, for I must to the greenwood go, alone a banished man, but have him well protected against the evil eye. Almost a pagan belief here. It's something dark is looking at him. It's been a great comfort for me to think of the boy, that being Michael, is in his hand, stabbing Father Consett. And then, of course, Sylvia comes in. Father Consett, she said, was hung on the day they shot Casement. That puts us after the Easter Rising of 1916. They dare not put it into the papers because he was a priest, and all the witnesses were Ulster witnesses. Now remember, Father Consett, though Catholic, could spar against Tietjens. He was seen to be a man of respectable character, and the war and its indirect effects, that being the Easter 1916 rebellion in Ireland, has seen to him as well. But let's look at the opening two paragraphs of chapter 2, in which the war broke the English character. These are Ford's words. It has been remarked that the peculiarly English habit of self-suppression in matters of emotion puts the Englishman at a great disadvantage in moments of unusual stresses. In the smaller matters of the general run of life, he will be impeccable and not to be moved, but in sudden confrontations of anything but physical dangers he is apt, he is indeed almost certain, to go to pieces very badly. This, at least, was the view of Christopher Tietjens, and he very much dreaded his interview with Lord Portskatho, because he feared that he must be near breaking point. In electing to be peculiarly English in habits, and in as much of his temperament as he could control, for though no man can choose the land of his birth or his ancestry, he can, if he have industry and determination, so watch over himself as materially to modify his automatic habits. Tietjens had quite advisedly and of set purpose adopted a habit of behaviour that he had considered to be the best in the world for the normal life. If every day and all day long you chatter at high pitch and with the logic of lucidity of the Frenchman, if you shout in self-assertion with your hat on your stomach, bowing from a stiff spine, and by implication threaten all day long to shoot your interlocutor like the Prussian, if you are as lacrimally emotional as the Italian, or as dryly and epigrammatically imbecile over unessentials as the American, you will have a noisy, troublesome, and thoughtless society, without any of the surface calm that should distinguish the atmosphere of men when they are together. You will never have deep armchairs in which to sit for hours in clubs thinking of nothing at all, or of the off theory in bowling. On the other hand, in the face of death, except at sea, by fire, railway accident, or accidental drowning in rivers, in the face of madness, passion, dishonour, or, and particularly, prolonged mental strain, you will have all the disadvantage of the beginner at any game, and may come off very badly indeed. Fortunately, death, love, public dishonour, and the like are rare occurrences in the life of the average man, so that the great advantage would seem to have lain with English society, at any rates before the later months of the year 1914. Death for man came but once, the danger of death so seldom as to be practically negligible. Love of a distracting kind was a disease merely of the weak. Public dishonour, for persons of position, so great was the hushing up power of the ruling class, and the power of absorption of the remoter colonies, was practically unknown. But that hushing up has become undone, and it results not only in the 1914 war being a mental effect on him, but the lack of hushing up around Tietjens, and of course the complete opposite, the invention of relationships of Tietjens with Mrs. Duchemin, with Valentine Wanop. Of course, we have the question mark over Valentine Wanop's relationship to Tietjens' father, which I mentioned in the previous episode. The lack of hushing up being the spiritual breakdown of his father, who has the circumstantial death of crawling through the hedge, ostensibly chasing after a rabbit on his own land, Groby, again symbolic. Mr. Tietjens enters the hedgerow for his own demise. About whether it was a suicide or not, it likely was, though again Ford leaves the element of doubt there, that perhaps the safety was off and he was merely going after a rabbit. But the idea is he has learnt of the reasons for Christopher's ruin, and it leads not only to Christopher's ruin but a Tietjens' ruin more ultimately. Mark is less perturbed than Mr. Tietjens about these rumours. Of course, we've already established this air of dissociation about him. And he thinks, for instance, page 210, he considers Valentine a regular tart, or at least is blunt with Christopher that this is what he hears, but he believes a man can keep a girl if he keeps her decently. He also says it's good to just stick to one woman. He doesn't seem too shocked or too put off by the idea of Miss Wanop being his Christopher's mistress.
Irish priest caught spying for the enemy. His trial was kept secret. Father Concert, almost part of the family. Let's see.
On a train coming down from Scotland. Lady Claudine saw them. So did General Campion. Brownlie painted an unpretty picture. The money his mother left him must have gone mostly to set her up with McMaster. God only knows what arrangement they make over her.
What else?
Sylvia's son is probably the result of an affair before her marriage. A man who's a member here.
Good God.
I'm sorry to put all this on you. But you want to know, I suppose.
Go on.
Then, of course, Christopher took her back after the Perone business.
Broke his mother's heart.
Ruggles says Christopher's willing to sell his wife for money or favours.
I kept him short. I let him go to the devil.
As for his career, he's written off as more or less a French spy. At least they're our allies. The worst part is, he got mixed up with a young woman. Apparently a pacifist suffragette type. Gilbert Wanop's daughter.
Oh, God. Christopher?
At least 5 people told Ruggles that he gave the girl a bastard before the war.
That's enough. And Groby will go to a papist child from the wrong side of the blanket. That's bitter, I don't mind saying. We've held Groby in the English church through 10 reigns. And I let it slip.
Father.
So the idea of the book and the black mark. Let's look at some lines from Ford about this. Ruggles in the meantime had collected a very full budget of news and inferences to present to Mark Tietjens whilst shaving. Mark had been neither surprised nor indignant. He had been accustomed to call all of his father's children except the brother immediately next, the whelps, and their concerns had been no concerns of his. They would marry, beget unimportant children, who would form collateral lines of Tietjens, disappear as is the fate of sons and younger sons. And the deaths of the intermediate brothers had been so recent, that Mark is not yet used to thinking of Christopher as anything but a whelp, a person whose actions might be disagreeable but couldn't matter. Mr. Tietjens himself, then, was a reasonable man, not reasonable enough to doubt Ruggles' circumstantial history. He believed implicitly in the great book, which has been believed in by several generations of country gentlemen. He perceived that his brilliant son had made no advancement commensurate with either his brilliance or his influence. He suspected that brilliance was synonymous with reprehensible tendencies. Moreover, his old friend General Folliot had definitely told him some days before that he ought to inquire into the goings-on of Christopher. On being pressed, Folliot had also definitely stated that Christopher was suspected of very dishonourable dealings, both in money and women. Ruggles' allegations came, therefore, as a definite confirmation of suspicions that appeared only too well backed up. What broke his heart was not that Christopher should not only, this is page 207, what broke his heart was that Christopher should not only have seduced but should have had a child by Valentine Wannop. Mr. Tietjens had always believed in his duty to patronise the arts, and if he had actually done little in his direction beyond purchasing some chocolate-coloured pictures of the French historic school, he had for long prided himself on what he had done for the widow and children of his old friend Professor Wannop. So here in page 207 we are slightly inside Mr. Tietjens' head for once. He considered with justice that he had made Mrs. Wannop a novelist, and he considered her to be a very great novelist. But the idea that Tietjens has made Miss Wannop his mistress, had not overplayed Mr. Tietjens. Mr. Tietjens entertained for Valentine Wannop an affection of the very deepest. The same qualities appealing to the father as appealed to the son. He had even, in spite of his 60-odd years, seriously entertained the idea of marrying the girl. So there you have it. Mark's suspicions of the relationship being incestuous seem unfounded, especially in the light of Ford giving us those brief paragraphs inside Mr. Tietjens' head. The appalling strife that hits Mr. Tietjens. He is appalled by Tietjens' behaviour because they seem to be delineating from Mr. Tietjens' deepest set of emotions, especially with that of the Wannops stir in him. That of devotion, duty, love, passion, but all should be constrained, and you should act honourably around them. The rumours that Ruffles gives him, relayed through Mark, means that he becomes disillusioned with his son Christopher's behaviour, a son he now realises is going to be heir to Groby. So not incestuous, but actually Mr. Tietjens mirrors a lot of his son Christopher's feelings with regards to the Wannops. And there's even that pagan return to the earth of Mr. Tietjens and that strange sense of paganism and earthly place that we see in Christopher. So it's actually not an incestuous relationship, not an abhorrence of that, but a linking between father and son and character. So what's left after Ruin, of course, is Wannop herself. And what happens to Wannop in this episode is that she becomes, her relationship with Mrs. Dushman, now Mrs. McMaster, entirely breaks down. We've seen Mrs. McMaster on this trajectory throughout episode 2, and now we see the final coming together of it. Where for her, Edith Ethel, then Dushman, then McMaster, she sees Vincent McMaster's knighthood as something that cannot have come through Tietjens, even though it has entirely come through Tietjens. Valentine Wannop knows this, relays it, and the truth is too much for Edith to take. And so again, Valentine is being something truthful, Edith as going for the flowery declarations of honor and so on without the actual acting of honor, the ability to act honorable. We mentioned this in their choices of men in episode 2, and again in the confrontation they have here, that separates them, comes across. Valentine will search for the truth in the affair of the calculation being that of Christopher. Edith wants to rise through society and will go along with the gossips and the lies, i.e. that Valentine one-up has had a war baby and so on, rather than perceive the truth. Stings her when one-up addresses it. Valentine also in the meantime has taken up a job as a teacher. Page 259 we get an interesting insight into this. Her conviction as the moral incidents of sex were, she knew, quite opportunist. Brought up amongst the rather advanced young people, she had been publicly challenged to pronounce her views. She would probably, out of loyalty to her comrades, have declared that neither morality nor any ethical aspects were concerned in the matter. Like most of her young friends, influenced by the advanced teachers and tendential novelists of the day, she would have stated herself to advocate an, of course, enlightened promiscuity. That before the revelations of Mrs. Duchemin. Remember the sexual shock she occurred when Mrs. Duchemin seeks for the abortion. That happened in episode 2, The Eve of the War. Actually, she had thought very little about the matter. What's interesting about this passage is Valentine realizes throughout the course, we first see her, she's enlightened suffragette. The Great March of Progress is occurring throughout the and through her exposure to Christopher as well, and the world as it really is, she sees that she's not biting against the grain, as it were. This idea of enlightened promiscuity is the new vogue. And actually, Tietjens, by being authentically reactionary, is in the glass cabinet. And so, by episode 3, she's well along that passage, and she takes up this idea of teaching the younger students, but she's actually already teaching against the grain, even by trying to have a balanced discussion or opinion on the idea of enlightened promiscuity. She's seen what happened with Mrs. Duchemin. She's seeing the gossip and the ruin of Tietjens, and it's making her have second thoughts about the milieu in general. As for Mrs. Duchemin and her role as McMaster's Igaria, let's go to Ford's great words on 260. Being brought right up against the sexual necessities of a first-class Igaria had been for her, Valentine, a horrible affair, for Mrs. Duchemin had revealed the fact that her circumspect continent and suavely aesthetic personality was doubled by another at least as coarse as and indefinitely more incisive in expression than that of the drunken cook. The language she had used about her lover, calling him always that oaf or that beast, had seemed literally to pain the girl internally, as if it had caused so many fallings away of internal supports at each 2 or 3 chords. And then Valentine thought that amongst that terrible crashing anguishes of that time there would be nothing for it but surrender, with the unceasing, never-ceasing thought of suffering, with the never-ceasing idea that her lover too must soon be so suffering. There was in the world no other refuge, no other. She surrendered, she awaited for him to speak. Stoppard concludes episode 3 with 3 scenes. This is the farewell of Tietjens with one up at the station and Mark. His scene at McMaster's in the evening. His last seeing of himself with McMaster. And then his final farewell to England as he heads back to the war. This isn't to stir himself in the same sense as in 1914. This is a war from which there's now no coming back. That's at least the opinion. And we see that encompassed when he says to Mark, this is the end of England, when he sees that the draft has come in.
You've seen the last of England. The professional army that soars through the last 100 years has every man of them dead. Civilization has gone to war in their place. No barbarians now.
So while we have all the ruin things happen towards the back end of the episode. Mark learns of Valentine and permits it and has a talk to her, discusses the idea of a future, moves Tietjens away from the front lines, gives him a chance to survive the carnage. And of course we have the Sylvia talking via the telephone. Of course it would have to be via some sort of technological form, the two women that march into Tietjens' future, Sylvia and Valentine, to get off the grass, where she says Sylvia to Valentine to get off the grass, with the illusion that Valentine is already in an ongoing relationship with Christopher. The nature of Tietjens' wife occupied her mind. Before, she had barely thought about her. She had seemed unreal, so mysterious as to be a myth, radiant, high-stepping, like a great stag. So the beginning of the confrontation between them is the beginning of the reality. When Sylvia Tietjens to Valentine ceases to become something mythical, reality can form itself, and a different future beyond the ruin can begin to be seen. It's glimpsed there, but of course you still need to go through the nadir of hell, which is the war. The war needs to conclude. And that's why, even despite the idea that Tietjens is now happy for Valentine to become his mistress, it won't come together. Circumstances will deny it at this point, because the war needs to end and the dawn needs to rise, after the armistice. The circumstance in particular is that Edward comes back from leave. He's now serving in the Navy. And again, that's another reality. We always said Edward Wannop was the secondary character. Yet his move from Cambridgeite communist to becoming some glimmers of patriotism there through serving in the Navy, as if the reality of the war again still hits him when he goes out into service. So it's a little nod to that it's Edward who comes in and prevents it. That even this man, aloof, Cambridge, supplied by Mr. Tietjens' money through the best education. Apologies, it is Oxford. It's Magdalen Oxford. I keep thinking he goes through Cambridge. So also we have the goodbye between McMaster and Tietjens. I just want to say there is this nice redemptive moment of McMaster here. He's gotten the knighthood. He's rising up through the echelons. He's swimming in the circles that Mrs. Duchemin wants him to go to. He wants to go to them himself as well, of course. But he doesn't seem to stray as far from his humble roots as Duchemin. He knows, more than his wife, that Tietjens is responsible for the knighthood. And there's an element of honour. I mean, he spent too long around Tietjens. Remember, he was, in essence, Tietjens' protege. He spent too long around him to have no shred, to forget him. And so when he sees Christopher leaving his party to go back to the war, leaving the Fridays at McMaster's, these little celebrity soirees, he has to have the confrontation with him, the final goodbye. And he also wishes him the best on his endeavours with Valentine. He realises, and he's always been the supporter of this, the ending of the relationship with Sylvia. He sees in Valentine a future for Tietjens. "Tell her," he said, "good God, you may be killed. I beg you. I beg you to believe I will, like the apple of my eye." In the swift glance that Tietjens took his face, he could see that McMaster's eyes were full of tears. They both stood looking down at the stone stairs for a long time. Then McMaster had said, "Well." Tietjens had said, "Well." But he hadn't been able to look at McMaster's eyes, though he had felt his friend's eyes pitiably exploring his own face. A backstairs way out of it, he had thought. A queer thing that you couldn't look in the face a man you were never going to see again. But by God, he said to himself fiercely, when his mind came back again to the girl in front of him, this wasn't going to be another backstairs exit. I must tell her, if damned if I don't make an effort. And so we'll close it there with the idea that Tietjens is going to make the effort and to come back from the war and to have a future with Valentine, and to realise that there is something there, a future waiting for him beyond ruin. Till the next time.
Forgive me, please. Cressy? Cressy? Chrissy! Wait! You're not going. I wanted to explain. This miserable night.
That's all right, old man. We've been pals long enough for a little thing like that, no? I'm very glad for you. Truly.
And Valentine?
It's all right. She's at another party. I'm going on.
Tell her. You may be killed. I beg you to believe I will never abandon her.
Yes.
Well.
And yet, I may not say, this is an accursed war.
You may for me.